Hey everybody, I'm going to be talking about Nancy Armstrong's introduction from her book Desire and Domestic Fiction. While her work mainly focuses on British literature, her ideas can still be applied to American novels like The Coquette. Her excerpt traces the history of the British novel, but places it alongside the history of sexuality. She argues on page 5 that interpretations of desire are the densely interwoven fabric of common sense and sentimentality that even today ensures the ubiquity of middle-class power. In other words, she's basically saying domestic fiction drives the ideologies and social constructs that reinforce the power and commonality of the middle class. On page 26, Armstrong reiterates that point by striving to consider the ways in which gender collaborates with class to contain forms of political resistance. So while domestic fiction presents examples of sexuality and female desire, it ultimately contains women like Eliza in preventing them from breaking societal norms. For instance, Eliza's fate, right? After her sexual encounter with Sanford, she faces consequences. Her baby dies, and so does she. This didactic ending showcases the ways in which women are held to strict standards of conduct. On page 3, Armstrong says that domestic fiction actively sought to disentangle the language of sexual relations from the language of politics. This power emerged with the rise of the domestic woman and established its hold over British culture through her dominance over all those objects and practices we associate with private life. With this passage, I definitely connected it to manifest domesticity that we learned earlier in the semester. Overall, I find Armstrong's outline of her ideas kind of messy, but she proves those points by analyzing sexuality as a cultural construct. The first part of her essay kind of breaks down um, the cultural constructs of gender and those stereotypical roles assigned to each gender. She uses Foucault's The History of Sexuality as support. So on page 14, she also looks at how written language was dismantled to form the masculine and feminine spheres that characterize modern culture. This interpretation of novels suggests they are a tool to reinforce gender performance, and she argues that those perspectives were still present in 1987 when she wrote her book. And I think the subjectivity of gender is finally starting to evolve from the stereotypical ideas of what it means to be masculine or feminine. It's much more fluid now than it was when Armstrong was writing this piece. Basically, Armstrong claims that previous critics ignored the history of sexuality when discussing the novel. She questions why there is no history of the English novel in explaining why literature began being written for, about, and by women. And she talks about this on page 7. Because a majority of 18th century novels were written by women. She looks at critics like Gilbert and Guvar's The Mad Woman in the Attic, and who argue that women authors had to manage the difficult task of simultaneously subverting and conforming to patriarchal standards. Armstrong ultimately still thinks that while they address the role of women authors, they ignore the historical conditions women faced and their place in history. She thinks that they ignore the political interests that such writing served. So she develops her own kind of history of novels and tries to incorporate sexuality into this new history that she's looking at. So Armstrong focuses specifically on the 18th and 19th century novels. She uses Pamela, Wuthering Heights, and Jane Eyre as examples. She also spends some time looking at the education ideologies of Maria Edgeworth. And on page 4, she differentiates the two centuries. She says the 18th century literature devoted to producing domestic women thus appeared to ignore the political world run by men. And then in contrast, she says 19th century literature showed men were no longer political creatures so much as they were products of desire and producers of domestic life. On page 6, she says, readers remain thoroughly enchanted by narratives in which a woman's virtue alone overcomes sexual aggression and transforms male desire into middle-class love, the stuff that modern families are made of. So basically she's saying that sexual desire is domesticated in novels of the 18th and 19th century. However, I think in the case of the Coquette, we aren't seeing Eliza overcoming this sexual aggression with Sanford. Obviously, she ends up dying, and Sanford, while he feels guilty, does not transform into the middle class. He loses his wife and he loses his money. So while I think the book was trying to domesticate its readers, I don't know if the characters in the novel were fully domesticated. Armstrong also focuses on the contradictory elements of the Enlightenment for the 18th and 19th century. So on page 12, the discovery of repressed sexuality thus provided justification for reading and interpreting sexual behavior, wherever one found it, always with the Enlightenment motive of discovering truth and producing freedom, always, consequently, with the very different result of enclosing sex within an individual's subjectivity. So during this time, people were starting to analyze sexuality, but ultimately they would still end up conforming to society's views on it and maintain the ideologies from the past kind of Puritan perspectives. And Eliza represents this new woman of the Enlightenment. However, she is constantly reverting back to traditional ideas of love and desire, either from her own thinking or pressures from friends, parents. She desires independence, choice, and time, and she dreads the thought of having a husband. For instance, in letter 14, Eliza states, I recoil at the thought of immediately forming a connection which must confine me to the duties of domestic life, and make me dependent for happiness, perhaps too for substance, upon a class of people who will claim the right of scrutinizing every part of my conduct. So in this moment, it appears that Hannah Webster Foster is acknowledging the bind that women of this time found themselves in, which aligns with Armstrong's arguments regarding subjectivity. Eliza wants to be independent and free, yet society prevents her from achieving that desire. She knows she must eventually enter into a traditional role, but she wants to put it off as long as possible. This situation, as Armstrong puts it on page 13, is the myth of progressive enlightenment. So this is leading into my next point about literacy and docility. Armstrong looks to Maria Edgeworth, who is a famous Anglo-Irish writer from the late 18th century, for using literature to create compliance in regards to women in the middle class. So on page 15, Armstrong talks about how the Edgeworths accept the view that prevailed during the 18th century, which said fiction behaved subversely and misled female desire. So she's basically saying that by having women read these books that talk about sexuality, it could potentially cultivate their heart prematurely and make them think too much about love, and it might lower their mind and make them indifferent to common pleasures and occupations. So at first they're kind of like, don't let them read these things. They might become corrupt by them. And so instead they would recommend that girls should be reading Robinson Crusoe, more so than boys, which Robinson Crusoe is like an adventure novel. And it's kind of sad. She's kind of like, yeah, they like wanted girls to read Robinson Crusoe so that because they won't ever, have the chance to go on these adventures, and so we don't have to worry about them because they won't ever have to deal with that issue. Whereas the boys, they shouldn't read Robinson Crusoe because they might get the idea that they should go on these adventures and then something bad could happen to them. But girls, why not? They don't get to go on adventures anyway. So this kind of continued into the Industrial Revolution, and it grew even bigger in that reading could prevent youth and the working class from causing trouble. Um, so it was like a distraction that could prevent people from committing acts of resistance. So on page 18, Armstrong continues, reading such works of fiction would still have the desirable effect of inducing a specific form of political unconscious. I think you could compare this to, okay, let's occupy the idle hours of women with examples of desire so that they spend time reading about it versus actually going out and doing it themselves. So that is continuing to kind of reinforce those gender roles and providing that kind of didactic moral message to not do what is in these novels, but also be entertained by them so that you don't get the idea to go do those things yourself because you're preoccupied, you're reading. So this calls into question the purpose of texts like the Coquette. Was it trying to pacify the American society in some way by appealing to scandalous material so that women and people in the middle class would be distracted from something else? And then finally, another element that Armstrong talks about is domestic surveillance, and she connects this with Foucault's Discipline and Punish. On page 19, she states the 19th century women have power of domestic surveillance and gained authority over domestic relations and personal life. I think Mrs. Richmond and Lucy could serve as examples of domestic surveillance. Mrs. Richmond offers Eliza numerous warnings about Sandford throughout the book. For instance, in letter 9, she says, Sandford falls far below the title of a gentleman, since he is deficient in one of the great essentials of the character, and that is virtue. And on page 20, Armstrong continues, the aristocratic woman represented surface instead of depth, embodied material instead of moral value, and displayed idle sensuality instead of constant diligence and tireless concern for the well-being of others. Such a woman was not truly female. So again, I think that reinforces the idea that Eliza is a woman of the Enlightenment, and some of the other female characters like Mrs. Richmond and Lucy kind of serve as opposites to her of what a woman should be like. So in letter 13, Lucy says of her friend Eliza, I know your ambition is to make a distinguished figure in the first class of polished society, to shine in the gay circle of fashionable amusements, and to bear off the palm against the votaries of pleasure. These are fading honors, unsatisfactory enjoyments. So again, we have one of Eliza's friends kind of trying to have that domestic surveillance on Eliza and to keep her on track. Ultimately, Eliza's coquettish tendencies deny her claims to 19th century womanhood. Unlike Lucy and Mrs. Richmond, she isn't observant about what could be preying on her virtue. So that leads into my questions. I'm sorry that I have a long video, but feel free to freeze the screen so you can look at the questions and you can read through them yourself. Thanks.